welcome everybody to our very first show of PoetSpeak with Broadstone Books. I'm Alison Palmer. I'm an editor with Broadstone Books, and
I'm Samantha Ratcliffe, and I'm also an editor with Broadstone Books.
today we have a very exciting pair. We have two very distinguished guests with us. We have Martha Collins and we have Susana H. Case. So welcome both of you. Um, what I'd like to do, I think it would be great to just jump right into some readings. So I think Martha's going to read from her most recent collection, Casualty Reports.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Allison. Yes, I'm going to read two poems from my book, Casualty Reports, which came out in 2022. Two of the five sections focus on coal mining, beginning with poems about my grandfather and great-grandfather, who were coal miners in southern Illinois, and ending with poems that focus on more contemporary concerns. This is the last poem in that sequence. Blessing. Where we dug up the graves of Black slaves who mined the first coal in Illinois, where we desecrated the graves of indigenous people that covered coal in the Southwest, where we dug up animals, plants in their graves and burned them as oil and gas and coal. There and throughout our earth, let us grieve for the graves we robbed, and then let us bless the graves of the dead that remain, and over them for the living, the wind, the sun. And the second poem I'll read is the last one in the book's final section, which turns from larger concerns to more personal ones. There's some words in parentheses, which I'll indicate. Inscriptions for a pool. There it is you, always again. Here it is not you, but the idea of occupied space in my mind, or blue film over blue. And there, what is, what were we? Here on the occupied page, where wrote could for cloud, read light showers, and opened my eyes to were written into that pool as if by hand, our own, as if we. Here on the page, Lacunaya's text, absence not, idea. There you are.
Thank you, Martha. I have to admit, I'm selfish with both Susanna and Martha helping pick these poems because I was so excited to hear both of you read, which you're going to read. While I have Martha that just read, I want to tell everybody a little bit about Martha. Martha's 11th book of poetry is Casualty Reports from the Pitt Poetry Series, University of Pittsburgh Press, released in 2022. Her 10th book, Because What Else Could I Do?, won the Poetry Society of America's William Carlos Williams Award. Martha was Pauline Delaney Professor of Creative Writing at Oberlin College for 10 years, which is where I had the pleasure of first meeting and working with Martha, not until my senior year when we worked on my senior thesis together. It was a pleasure. Among many, many other distinguished recognitions, in August, Martha will be awarded the Golden Rose Award from the New England Poetry Club, which is one of the oldest literary prizes in the country, it's phenomenal, so exciting. So congratulations, Martha. And you can find Martha's full bio because I can't list everything, which is a massive amount of achievements for both Martha and Susanna, on her website, marthacollinspoet.com. And now we're going to turn to Susanna. Susanna Case is going to be reading from If This Isn't Love.
Thank you, Allison and Sam, for hosting us. And Martha, I'm thrilled to be on the program with you. I admire your work tremendously. And I don't know if it was accidental or serendipity that the poems you requested both of us to read moved from um, death and graves to something more personal. So these are my two on the subject. The first is Bone Church. In San Bernardino, Aliosa, Milano, as in other ossuaries, the bones of the dead are placed into designs, crosses formed with skulls, flourishes made from tibiae and femurs under the vaulted dark wood. A skull cathedral on pillars, walls, and doors, tightly packed shelves of bone clutter sheltered by a worn frescoed ceiling, a patterned insufficiency of remembrance. So many deaths, the medieval graveyard full of bones exposed from the earth, patients from the leper hospital, monks, beheaded prisoners. And in an America of crosses, flowers and stuffed animals, part of a child's destroyed jaw, discreetly covered in an open casket, another American shooting. The small bones of small bodies in San Bernardino alla Osa on All Souls Day, they say a little girl comes back to life and dances with fellow skeletons. And this is Steps. I'd forgotten how many steps it takes to descend this treacherous trail that long ago was used by Santorini donkeys. You are so much more sure-footed and already farther ahead. The shifting gravel and kicked up dust make me feel I'm too old for dirt, that I should have stowed the sneakers, stayed back to sip grappa, read magazines by the pool, forgetting the girl who skipped down the slippery slope so many years ago in the first flowering of freedom after she kicked through the thick fishnet of her contentious first marriage, making this a sort of love poem and not the first one to you, and to the foolish girl who thought she might be alone the rest of her life, but ended up fine, happy even, pausing to steady herself, to squint at the impossible blue.
Thank you, Susanna. I love those poems. And yes, I on purpose was thinking about the dichotomy of love and loss, lamentation and love in both of your books. And your wider work, definitely, but these books in particular. So I'm gonna let Sam talk a little bit about Susanna.
Yeah, it is an honor to introduce Susanna H. Case, the author of 9 books of poetry. If This Isn't Love is Susanna's most recent collection from Broadstone Books, published in 2023. In 2022, The Damage Done, also from Broadstone Books, won the Pinnacle Award for Best Poetry Book, as did her 2020 book, Dead Shark on the N Train, which was a New York City Big Book Awards distinguished favorite and a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Book Award. And you can read her full bio on her website, susannahcase.com.
Thank you. So let's jump right into some good conversation. So I am really interested, like I said, in talking about lamentation, love, and research in your books, along with various expressions and different levels of grief that you all encounter in these books for wars, personal losses, racism. I see in your work also many expressions of love and different forms of love. So, can each of you talk a little bit about your writing styles and how your new books function as different forms of lamentation and or love? Martha, you're welcome to begin if you think you're muted.
Sorry. So this new book, it's really, even the love poems are lamentations. And even the lamentations are, in a sense, love poems, though many of them are love poems in a much larger sense. So let me just say a little bit about the book and then a little bit about my styles. There are 5 sections in this book. 2 are about coal mining, which I've been conscious of for a long time. My grandfather and great-grandfather were coal miners in southern Illinois. And so I approached family in a loving way. And the second section ends with poems that focus on more contemporary concerns. Some of the poems celebrate my ancestors. For example, they celebrate the importance of coal mining for the Union movement, but there are many laments for the deleterious effects of coal mining on miners and for the broader impacts of coal mining on our economy and environment. The second section of the book focuses on race and related subjects, including gun violence, which is the subject of a poem actually called Lamentations that's very loosely modeled on the book of Lamentations in the Bible. The 4th section focuses on war, and the 5th is called And Also, which is more personal. Most of the poems are elegies for friends I've loved and also for my late husband, who died suddenly and tragically in 2016. So a little bit about my style, or I should say styles. I don't think of myself as having a style, but the style doesn't necessarily depend on the subject matter. The last poem I read uses a lot of fragmentation, stammerings, breakings off, repetitions, something I've sometimes used when I don't know something or when I'm trying to figure out something. But also in the poem I just read, when I'm trying to say something that's emotionally difficult. In this case, the poem is actually a lament, but it's also a love poem, and in some sense bringing back the person I'm lamenting. The other poem I read, the first one, uses repetition, the same words at the beginning of some lines, anaphora, repeated grammatical constructions, creating, I think, a kind of litany, appropriate here for something called a blessing. But this is also something I do quite a lot in my work. Instead of fragments, that's one thing, a series of connected phrases and clauses that keep moving as a single sentence.
Thank you. Yes. It's interesting that you say that just about style, because when I think of you, I think of both of those things. I think of litanies and I think of fragments and the difference. And I would argue that maybe when I think of your content, your subject matter, and I think of your fragmented work, that's what I think about in the more personal. And maybe that's more um from I'm sorry, now I'm totally blanking. From because what else could I do is more fragmented.
Yeah, that's true. But I really started doing this, well, not quite. Really started doing this in a big way with the first research-oriented poem that I wrote. A poem called Blue Front, which I'll say something about later. And it honestly was. I didn't know things, and so I would break off. The poem is called Blue Front, which is the name of a restaurant, and I was trying to figure out why was it called Blue Front, and I was stammering, trying to find the information. And it's kind of morphed into, even in that book, something that I do when I'm dealing with emotionally difficult material.
I see.
Sometimes it's so, as I said in the beginning, my shifting style doesn't really depend on subject matter. It's something else.
Yeah.
So
I understand. Yeah. Suzanne, talk a little bit about lamentation and love in If This Isn't Love.
I thought it was interesting that Martha said that love poems are lamentations, because I'm interested in writing about the grittiness of adult love and the experiences of girls and young women that get them to the point of struggle with this. And so, yes, it's not an idealized version for the most part. My work tends to be narrative. I sometimes have used fragments, but not certainly not in the iconic way that Martha does in her books. But I do like to frame my books if it's possible, the way that Martha, for example, used Madison Grant in the eugenics movement to frame her book Admit One. If this isn't love, soap opera is the frame. And I go back and forth between telenovela or soap opera versions of love and so-called real life, because there is an incredible amount of overlap between the two. But I'm also very interested in inequities of power, and gender power inequities are part of this. And so in my way of thinking, they impact love. So for that reason, it's unavoidable. I end up touching on violence in various forms. I mourn, for example, as Martha does, the constant shootings in this country, particularly the shootings of children. And in one of the many that have occurred, a child's face was so damaged that a cloth had to be placed over a part of her face in the casket. And that image stayed with me and eventually found its way into Bone Church, which was the poem that I read previously, the first one.
So I just want to say,
yeah,
can I just
absolutely.
say, I really appreciate your reading, Susana, and I love that poem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, so this brings me to kind of our next focal point, which is research and the different ways in which you both researched for these most recent books. Martha's way of researching, although Susana, I'm very interested to hear about the telenovela research and sort of the yeah, what kind of what that involved. So maybe Susana, start to talk to us a little bit about the telenovela, how that developed and how that frames your book. What kind of research was that? Also travel. Travel is a form of research I know plays a big part in all of your writing.
Yes, well, my research, and I think I would put that in quotes with "if this isn't love," because what it involved is watching many, many episodes of a soap opera that has been running for over 20 years in Italy, titled Un posto al sole. So it wasn't as textual as when I wrote The Damage Done, which was my earlier Broadstone book. And in that one, I read documents and archival material on the COINTELPRO years in which the book is set. These were years in which the FBI harassed progressive groups and individuals, including civil rights groups and indigenous rights groups, feminist groups, etc. And I'm a researcher by training, so this is something that is enjoyable to me. And I have gone into various archives with other poems, but with If This Isn't Love, my goal was to find correspondences between television fantasy and lived experience. In terms of a more general interest in research, though, it is interesting to me that both Martha and I have written, for example, about Ota Benga. Me in an earlier book, Four Rooms with View, and Martha more extensively in her book, I think was it in Casualty Reports?
Admit One. It was Admit One.
In Admit One.
Admit One. Yeah, here, Admit One. Yes. Yeah, it's the kind of thing I liked. Ota Benga, for the listeners, was a Congolese man brought to be exhibited at the World's Fair in the early 20th century. He ended up for a while in a cage at the Bronx Zoo. And of course, he could never go home. And eventually he committed suicide by shooting himself in the heart. And I think that we have both been, I don't want to speak for Martha, but I think we both have been horrified by all that his life and his misuse represents. So yes, when I do research, it is usually to write about something that is socio-political.
Can I I don't want to stop us, but I just want to say that what both of you guys are speaking to me about is how research is a form of honoring these voices. And as poets, I see you both as such truth tellers. So research itself feels like a aspect of love.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, yes. And I have a lot to say about travel, but I think I'll pause and let so that Martha can say something, and then I'll come back and talk about that.
Sure.
Okay, I think, Susanna, that watching all those episodes is research. One of the things that I did when I wrote, I have 3 books, I'll say something about that, but one of them is called White Papers, and I watched a whole lot of movies in writing just a little part of that book. There are 9 versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I watched them all. I watch cartoons, that cartoons that use blackface. That's research too. So I just want to say that it's a different kind. So yeah, lots and lots of research. And I'll just say a few little things about this book. On the coal mining part of this book, I used a whole lot of stuff, starting with the fact that my father had saved boxes of stuff from his father and grandfather: coal mining lamps, flashlights used in coal mines, a union pin, documents like this:
Oh, wow.
mining manual, Department of Mines and Minerals from Illinois. Um, I did a lot of research about coal mining, about coal miners' unions, about coal mining riots in Southern Illinois, books, scholarly articles, online research, even a children's book by Margaret Wise Brown of Goodnight Moon called Two Little Miners. Um, so the first section about coal is focused on Southern Illinois. And the second section, I had to do wider research. And I should say, like Susanna, I was also trained as a researcher. When I was in graduate school, I didn't like it. When I have a purpose like this, I love it. So I began by researching the prehistory of coal, that is, how it was formed by the animals and plants that are also lamented in that poem that I read called Blessing. I researched the history of coal mining, the types of coal mines, the science behind the ecological effects of coal mine. One poem actually gets at the history of coal mining by following the Oxford English Dictionary's lists of the changing meanings of coal. I did a lot of research in the race sections of the poem. Newspapers were a big source. And I think travel is also an important aspect of doing research. When I wrote one of these poems about a place where there was a victim who was killed by the police in the race section, I went to that very place, and much of what I consider my research was just being there. And I guess what I have to say about this book is that there's really not a poem in the first 4 sections of it that doesn't rely on some kind of research. And that is my expanded sense of research, in which I'm embracing everything that Susanna said as research too.
I just want to get back to travel a little bit, if I can, because
Absolutely.
I travel a lot, and
Over 60 countries, I hear.
Last count was 76.
Oh my goodness.
76.
That's impressive.
Well, those settings find their way into my poems, which aren't usually explicitly about travel. And in the case of the the poems in If This Wasn't Love, if This Wasn't Love, I was on Procida. This is an island. If this isn't love, I don't know why it's in the past tense now. This isn't love. I was on Procida, which is an island off the coast of Naples, and I stumbled into the filming of an episode of If This Isn't Love, which I had not heard of. the soap opera I had not heard of previously, Un Posto al Sole, perhaps because the episodes are only available on RAI, which is an Italian channel, and they were in Italian. But I'm a student of Italian, so I thought afterward I would take a look, maybe improve my ear a little bit for the language, which is pretty dreadful. Not the language, my ear. And I was engaged by the filming because I live in New York City. There's always a lot of filming being done here, and it's very organized here. Streets are blocked off, spectators are orderly. But there, it was total chaos. Tourists were eating gelato and wandering into the scenes piazza. Schoolgirls were screaming at seeing celebrities, even though they didn't necessarily know what their names were. And so they had to keep redoing, keep redoing the takes of this very short scene. And during the retakes, there were two actors, female and male. They're main characters in the telenovela, a woman and her rather nasty lover. And the female actor, who was gorgeous and wearing a stunning dress, remained totally fresh during all the takes, and her clothes were unwrinkled. Just nothing had to be done with to her between takes. But the male lover got more and more rumpled, and so he had to be continuously repowdered and such. And so it was amusing. And I was also taken with her. And so when I returned home, I started Googling, and then I started watching. And then I thought, here is a frame which I can use to organize a series of poems about love in its non-idealized form, which is a subject that I do continually write about.
This is really interesting. This leads me into talking about the personal and introspective aspects of both of your writings versus the more research and factual based aspects of your writing. And I'm wondering, what does research bring to the poetry table, and what might it lack? If we're talking about the personal and then factual and research based. I know, because I'm thinking about, Martha, when I watched you do one of your craft talks, you actually mentioned that it was very difficult for you to switch and write when your husband died tragically. That switch, I think, mentally was very different than your previous research-based work. And so I'm wondering, what talk a little bit about the differences you think about writing through research, and what that, if it sort of weighs any more heavily than personal introspective work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's see. I'm not sure what to add to what I've said about the research, but let me try this. Before my previous book, the one you mentioned, Because What Else Could I Do? I really had not written a lot of poetry that was really directly autobiographical, at least not since my first book or two. And even in those books, often things that were autobiographical, I would frame in the third person. But then something happened. I'd always used facts in my poems, but starting in 2005, research became central when I discovered that my father had witnessed a lynching as a 5-year-old in Southern Illinois. And the primary victim was predictably an African-American man. Now, to write a book about a lynching seems very different from writing a personal book. But in fact, I could not have written that book if I hadn't known that my father had seen that lynching. I couldn't have written about it. The book that Susana mentioned, Admit One, that's the third. I wrote another book called White Papers, and then I wrote Admit One. They're all together. I consider them a kind of trilogy about race. But Admit One also had a personal beginning. I had known for years, it was a story my mother told me, that her grandparents had gone to the 1904 World's Fair. And of course, what I knew about that fair was it was a great big fair, it was a big event, there were all kinds of wonderful exhibits and stuff. But then I went to a centennial exhibition of it with my mother and discovered that there were exhibits like, as Susanna mentioned, Oda Benga, who was a so-called pygmy from Africa. But the personal is always tied up in the research that I do. And if it weren't there, I don't know that I could do it. So I'm thinking about my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather. When I'm doing coal, I'm thinking about my father, trying to see through my father's eyes when I'm dealing with the lynching, trying to be back there with my grandparents, which wasn't too hard because my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a newspaper editor in a small town who wrote about the World's Fair. So all of that has this personal element to it as well. But then my husband died, and the book was challenging. And I would say it wasn't so much challenging to write. I dealt with my grief by addressing those poems to my deceased husband. I did not intend to publish them. I did not think of them as publishable poems. And as I wrote more, I began to think of them that way, and it was difficult. They were personal, they were mine. But I'm finally glad that I did publish them. The personal responses I've gotten to the book made me glad I did, because after all, personal expressions of grief resonate with almost everyone. But then I went back to research and casualty reports, and I'm glad I did that too. I don't know what research brings to the poetry table in general, but it certainly widens the territory that poetry can occupy. And I would say conversely, when poetry deals with topics that we think of as historical or social or political, the poetry that incorporates that research gives us a way of responding emotionally, not just intellectually, to history and events. An example from a little bit of far, I knew a great deal about the Vietnam War, but it wasn't until I began translating Vietnamese poems and knowing Vietnamese poems that I experienced that war on a very personal level. So on lack, research itself lacks everything poetic. When it's successfully transformed into poetry, it's all gain.
That's so interesting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say one little interjection. I have a realization that we as poets, we make everything personal, right? I mean, it's textual research, I think, is what I'm thinking, versus we all research, we mine our lives, right? So I just had that realization that really we make everything personal. Go
We
ahead,
do.
Susan. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if this might be of interest to you, Martha, to know that I came to the entire body of your work through But What Else Could I Do, which was the first of your books that I had read, and then began to read the others. So, yeah. So, and so, I mean, the personal and I don't know, do we want to call it confessional? That's such a bad word right now,
I
to say
know.
that. But I think of myself as somewhat confessional in my work. I don't see myself as a historian, although, I'm aware that I live in a period where history is disappearing, and it agitates me and makes me want to try harder to document things that are getting lost. But I think it can be very hard to be empirically based or socio-political and not be didactic. And I love the way, Martha, that you've successfully been able to do this, incorporating, for example, poems about guns and other social issues into a book that revolves around mining and your personal family history in casualty reports, and the persistence of racism as well. I've written about race only in The Damage Done, but one subject that I do return to over and over, one that's not confessional in nature or personal in nature, is gun violence. Guns appear in several of my books. In fact, I'll use that later as the subject of my closing poem, because guns and shootings found their way into If This Isn't Love as well. They just sort of so I think there are sometimes certain social or political topics that just demand to put themselves into your work, even if you're trying to write something that's not about that.
Yeah, this is a perfect lead in, Susanna, to my last sort of question and conversation for us. And it's a question that I'm really excited to be able to have this talk with both of you and Sam about this. So I'm dying to talk about the deeply personal and socio-political that we do read in both of your writings. And if poets shy away from writing about the hard truths, if we fall and fail to record all of the ghosts, the personal, the political, the historical, what becomes of us and our collective future? Or let me put it this way. Let me try to distill that question. What do we lose if we don't witness as poets? Basically, why is our writing important if we don't tell these truths? And I asked this question to both of you because you do have very socio-political writing, as well as the personal, if we want to say that. But whereas if I think about my body of work, I would not call myself a socio-political writer in any way. Some people may see it otherwise. But with your work, it seems so important because you do dig in to what is important, what is going on culturally, socially, politically. And if we don't do that, if we don't tell those truths, if we don't do the gritty, what happens?
Yeah, go. Susanna. Yeah.
I don't know that, unfortunately, poets are important enough to affect the trajectory of what happens in a socio-political context. But I think for our own sanity, sometimes we do need to bear witness to these things, even though the the um, the the public that is receptive to our poetry might be way smaller than the public that is receptive to something on TV news, for example, or even in a newspaper. So I don't see anything that I do is changing the world in a larger macro sense, but I am happy when I touch people individually and am led to understand that they have been touched that way.
No.
I'm going to go back to the Vietnamese. When I discovered Vietnamese poetry in the 1990s, I was just blown away. I had been a very young Vietnam War protester. I'd read about the war. I knew all these facts. And then I read these poems and I just thought, oh my God. It was the first time that I had really had a deep emotional response. I started trying to write poetry during the Vietnam War. I wrote terrible poems. One of them, I was trying to imagine being a Vietnamese woman during the war. And I had a refrain. It was, I don't know. And then these poems took me there. And I had this fantasy. I thought, so I remember the newspaper from the New York Times during the war, and they would have war pictures on the front page. What if just one day there had been one of these poems by a Vietnamese poet in place of the war picture? I don't think that would have changed the course of the war. It would have changed me. It would have changed me. And I am often changed myself. And in being changed myself, I don't know, I think I'm not only more aware, but probably more active. And I think when you say, picking up this phrase that you said, what becomes of the psyche of our collective future, I think the psyche of our collective future is so imperiled. It's just so imperiled, and so much more than when I wrote any of the poems I read today, or, that I think we have no choice. I think we can't fail to record. Not all the ghosts. Nobody can do it all. I mean, Susana, you say, you're focused on guns. My major focus of that sort has been on race. We can't all do everything. That would, but, you know, old Sunday school song, brighten the corner where you are. And often in these days, you brighten the corner by recording the ghosts who are not so bright.
Very true.
I just wanted to interject and say that in so many ways, all of us have either been teachers or are, in some education field and form. And I think that what you guys have said to me today is that we have to have an emotional response to history. And through this research and through our own experiences, even if it is a small, moment as a teacher, there have been many times where I've said, I can't reach the masses when it comes to these generations before me or in front of me. But what I can do is teach you how to feel something about what you just read that feels very scientific or it feels very research based because there's emotions behind that. So I appreciate both of your um, opinions today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Great.
Yep.
So we're going to close with poems from Martha and Susana. And I want to also close just by saying that this was a fabulous conversation. I could talk with you both for hours, and I know Sam could as well. This has just been absolutely wonderful. So we're going to close with poems by Martha and Susana.
I guess I'm first, right?
Go ahead.
So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Alison and Sam and Susana. I want to go out with you all now and have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine and
Yeah.
look and talk.
Yeah.
But somehow or other, we'll continue. So the last poem I'm going to read is also from Casualty Reports, and it's from the section on war. And it was written in 2009 during the siege of Gaza. But its relevance today, I think, is pretty obvious all these years later. For Gaza. For the woman who cooks on a fire of sticks and boards beside her shell of a house, her bag of clothes in a tree. For physician Ani al-Jarbu, his wife cut in half, his year-old son turned to pieces. For the 30 dead Samuni family members dug out of the rubble, for the living, including children who clutched dead mothers. For the schools and mosques and homes destroyed by bombs, for the graves disturbed by tanks. For the more than 1,300 dead, including those who walked from their homes as directed with white flags. For those going home to water their trees, lemon and almond and olive, and for those trees.
Thank you, Martha.
A good poem, it doesn't matter when it was written, it stays timely as your poem certainly has.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to close on a poem from If This Isn't Love. And this one, it's got some travel in it, but it's clearly not about travel. It's got guns in it too. And it's titled, 1 in 3 American Children is a Potential Gun Hilda. And where did I get that statistic? I researched. A bunch of us are lazing around after dinner downtown, savoring dessert and talking about when we'll need guns. Conspiracy theorists at the door. A third of American homes with kids have guns, and I'm revved up to learn to shoot, to take a few of the assassins with me before I die. But a few days later, I've calmed down. Do I really want to travel to New Jersey for lessons, guns so leaden to hold when I don't even carry a heavy purse? Gun is such a bland word, banal in looks and in the way Hannah Arendt meant, the quotidian opening of the door to doing evil. Gun comes from the Scandinavian, perhaps, Gunhilda, both halves of the name meaning war, a sort of doubled war. And yet there have been only 7 mass shootings in Sweden in the past 120 years and 611 just last year in the United States. A few months after the gun-filled Gunhilda discussion over dessert, we were at the end of a vacation in Stockholm and called a cab for the airport. That day, there was another mass shooting back home. The cab driver had heard the news on the radio. I still remember his voice when he told us, when he grabbed our luggage, the look on his face.
Thank you, Susanna. Those are absolutely beautiful poems, and you're exactly right. I was wondering when Forgazo was written, Martha, and Susanna, to close on that poem is it's heartbreaking and it's necessary. It's beautiful. Thank you. So this has been the first show of Poet Speak with Broadstone Books. I'm Alison Palmer with Samantha Ratcliffe.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
And we've had Martha Collins and Susana H. Case, and we will see everybody for another podcast in about a month. So thank you so much for listening and or watching, and we will see you again soon. Thank you so much again, Martha and Susanna.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
Thank you.